Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, if you are a person that watches a great amount of sports, or if you're a person overall that is into, that type of entertainment, if you watch a various amount of sports, it probably was a very good weekend for you because there was a lot of great sporting events that were happening this weekend. You had the Copa America, which happened yesterday. Argentina ended up winning its first grand title in a certain amount of years. Lionel Messi's first Copa America, which of course is very, very important to him. That's the only major title I believe he's ever won with Argentina. So that is something that is very, very special that happened yesterday. Of course, the Dustin Poirier versus Conor McGregor trilogy happened yesterday. Unfortunately, it had kind of an anticlimactic ending, but it is what it is. Hopefully later on we get to see a Dustin Poirier versus Charles Oliveira title fight, but we'll see what happens, and hopefully Conor maybe can come back well. But out of all those things, out of all those things that were happening, the thing, and I know that I don't usually comment on this sport. I know usually when it comes to the sports that I talk about, I usually tend to talk about boxing or MMA, or, if I do talk about other sports, it usually pertains to NFL or NBA. But a sport that I have very much loved ever since that I've been watching it is tennis. And tennis, there was going to be a great amount of history that would have been achieved here, that actually was achieved here, excuse me, if Mr. Novak Djokovic, was going to win the Wimbledon final. And he achieved that history today. And I think we need to talk about it. I think we need to talk about all the history that he has achieved this year and that really he has achieved within the past 10 years. And the reason why this was such a big part of history is now that Novak Djokovic has won this Wimbledon this year. At least now this is the third Grand Slam that he has won this year, which is, crazy on a whole nother level, but we'll talk about that here in a bit. Novak Djokovic now has tied the all-time Grand Slam record for men's all-time Grand Slams. He now also has the record with Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal. All three of them now have 20 Grand Slams each, a piece from them, which is absolutely crazy when it comes down to it. And now with the history that Novak Djokovic has accomplished and a certain amount of the other statistics that he has on his side and a certain amount of other things that he has on his side, we do now have to ask the question, is Novak Djokovic clearly the greatest men's tennis player of all time, or is he at least certainly the greatest out of the big three? Now, of course, a lot of people would debate that, the greatest tennis players of all time, that these actually are the three greatest men's tennis players of all time. And let me tell you something, I'm not going to argue against that when it comes down to it, because these three overall, they all three have 20 Grand Slams per each of them for a reason. So it is what it is, but we're going to talk about it. This is going to be, I'm going to try not to ramble on, but I'm very excited to talk about this topic because I've been waiting to talk about this topic for a very long time, and now that the history actually was achieved, I'm just very excited to talk about it, and let's just get into the conversation. So, first of all, what does this do for men's tennis? What does this mean for history? And does this Wimbledon title, his 20th Grand Slam, does this now mean that Novak Djokovic is the greatest men's tennis player of all time? If you were just to ask me flat out. What I'm going to say is this, man. I believe that it does. I think Novak Djokovic, personally, to be quite honest with you, as soon as he won that 19th Grand Slam title and he won that French Open this year and became the first man of the Open era to win at least every single Grand Slam twice, and the fact that you were able to do that with such a dominant clay court player like Rafael Nadal in your era, it really shows how complete of a player that Novak Djokovic is. And I think once he did that, I said, okay, this guy is clearly the front runner in the race. Even though he doesn't quite have 20 Grand Slam titles yet, he's clearly got to be winning this race. Usually, when it comes to titles and championships and stuff like that, usually whoever has more, they can be leading the race to me. Tennis is a little bit different. Like, if we were to talk about women's tennis, of course, if you're around my age, because I'm in my 20s, when it comes down to it, if you grew up, during the 2000s and 2010s, of course, if you were to watch women's tennis, then you would say overall the greatest of all time is probably Serena Williams, when it comes down to it. But in my opinion, just looking at the history, you can debate that there's a couple of, other girls that are in her, pack. In my opinion, the greatest women's tennis player of all time, you can debate either Serena Williams, Margaret Court, or Steffi Graf. I think that it comes down to those three. Some people may disagree, but when I take a look at it, those are the three most elite women tennis players that I've heard of. So it is what it is, at least when I take a look at the whole package. When it comes to men's tennis, there's of course always been a lot of all-time great players when it comes down to it, and many would debate that these three are the greatest ever. And Novak Djokovic, in my opinion, especially with the history that he was able to accomplish this year, I think he has to be leading this race. I think that he has to be in first place. I don't think that there's any doubt about that anymore. And to be quite honest with you, he was always, in my opinion, once he hit his peak, I always thought that Novak Djokovic was the most complete player out of all of them. I thought that he, I always thought that he debatably was the most talented, and that you could debate that he was the most skilled. Some people overall, would disagree with that, especially Roger Federer fans. But I would personally debate that Novak Djokovic, that he might be the most skilled tennis player that I've ever seen when he's at his best and the most dominant. I mean, Novak Djokovic, man, he is on an absolute tear. And for the past 10 years, when he really hit his stride in 2011 and he really hit his peak, that was the year that I believe the first time that he became the number one player in the world. And ever since 2011 onward, he's had his ups and downs here and there. But ever since 2011, really, that was when he hit his peak. That's really when his prime started. And Novak Djokovic, he's just been on a complete tear throughout this generation. And there's really never been a men's tennis player, at least, that I've seen be this dominant when it comes down to it. And a certain amount of people may disagree. But what are the points, in my opinion, that make Novak Djokovic clearly the greatest out of all three of them? Well, first of all, when it comes down to it, if we just want to start off with this little statistic, and of course many people will bring this up, immediately if you were going to argue Djokovic's side. Djokovic, of course, has the head-to-head record against both Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer. Now, he pretty much beats Roger Federer in almost every head-to-head stat when it comes down to it. Including, every, game that they faced in. Djokovic has beat him more than what Roger has beat him. On top of that, Novak Djokovic also leads against Roger Federer in Grand Slam games when it comes down to it. He's beaten him in more Grand Slam tournaments, I believe, than what Roger Federer has beat him, in Novak Djokovic. Rafael Nadal, it's a little bit different. Rafael Nadal, he actually has the winning record in Grand Slams over both of them. But I do think that it is important to mention when it comes to him versus Djokovic, at least, that, Rafael Nadal, of course, it's not like he just beats Novak Djokovic in the Roland Garros or on clay, but the numbers are very, very skewed in his direction because they've faced each other so many times in the Roland Garros when it comes down to it. I do understand that Rafael Nadal, he does have, more wins against Djokovic than what Djokovic has over him, also in the U.S. Open. And, of course, hard court is supposed to be Djokovic's main bread and butter. We all understand that. But a big part of the reasons why Rafael Nadal does have that advantage, I think, in the head-to-head finals tournaments or Grand Slam tournaments is because, they've literally faced each other I don't know how many times in the Roland Garros. The record is 7-2. So that shows you how many times they've faced each other there. And then, of course, Rafael Nadal, he beat Novak Djokovic once in the Wimbledon, I believe, a very long time ago. And then he beat him twice in the U.S. Open. So I think the record is 10-8 at this point in time, but I could be wrong about that. So it's, it's not like it's a huge advantage when it comes down to it, but it is a slight advantage for Nadal. Either way, if you did want to give Nadal the edge in that category and say maybe that's a point for Nadal, I would certainly understand that. But we do have to take things into context. A big part of the reason why it is in Nadal's advantage is because they faced each other so many times on Nadal's preferred surface on that clay Roland Garros tournament than usually what they have in other tournaments. But to give Nadal credit, like I said, he does have a 2-1 advantage record over Novak Djokovic. I'm actually personally hoping that we get to see a Rafael Nadal versus Novak Djokovic final this year in the U.S. Open. That's what I'm really hoping we get to see. But we'll see what happens with that. But anyways, if you were going to argue it, Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer, they do not have the winning record over Novak Djokovic, period. And the fact that Rafael Nadal had Novak Djokovic on his preferred surface. Rafael Nadal was on his preferred surface, that is, in the French Open this year in the semifinals. And the fact that Novak Djokovic was able to come up big, and overall, the fact that Novak Djokovic, that he would have, that the head-to-head would have been tied had Rafael Nadal won that matchup, which he was supposed to when it came down to it. The fact that Novak Djokovic still has the head-to-head record after that, it still means a lot. And here's actually a very important statistic. I actually believe now that they have faced each other, because Novak Djokovic, he's known as better on hard court and on grass court compared to Nadal, while Nadal overall is better on clay court. Now, certain Rafael Nadal fans, they don't like the argument overall that Novak Djokovic is better on grass, but come on. I mean, I think we all know who's the better player on grass court, at least at their best when it comes down to it. I don't think that, there's any fooling anybody there. So it is what it is. But when it comes down to it, now Rafael Nadal and Novak Djokovic, first of all, they played each other an even amount of times on grass. I believe they're 2-2 there. But Novak Djokovic, let's be real, he is the greater grass court player. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And if we were to take it to the biggest stage of grass court, which is the Wimbledon, Djokovic has the advantage 2-1 there when it comes down to it. So that is very important to say. On top of that, Djokovic now has 6 Wimbledon titles. Rafael Nadal only has 2 when it comes down to it. So that's something, that's important to say. But Novak Djokovic and Rafael Nadal, they faced each other an even amount of times now also on hard court as they have on clay court. And the fact now, I believe Novak Djokovic, he can now say that he's beaten Nadal more on clay than what Nadal has beat him on hard court, I believe. That's actually a very important distinction when it comes down to it. I think that's a very important stat when it comes down to it, because once again, Nadal, he's supposed to be the king of clay. Novak Djokovic, he's supposed to be the king of hard court, and at his best also be the king of grass court. And Novak Djokovic, he clearly has the advantage in 2 of those courts when it comes down to it. Obviously, Nadal, he is better on clay, but the fact that Novak Djokovic still holds that head-to-head record over Rafael Nadal, now that they faced an even amount of times on all courts when it comes down to it, that's very interesting to me when it comes down to it. At least, they faced each other the same amount of times on hard court now that they have on clay court, and an even amount of times on grass. So just to clarify there, so at least I believe. So, the fact that Novak Djokovic still holds that head-to-head record, that's huge, in my opinion. That's a huge, huge thing, and of course, he holds the thing over Roger Federer. And I'm sure if you were a Roger Federer fan, you would try to debate that Roger Federer, at least before Djokovic, was the best hard court player and probably was the best grass court player. I don't think that he beats Djokovic in either of those categories when it comes down to it. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So the first point being is that Novak Djokovic has the head-to-head record over both of them. Second point that I want to bring up is that he clearly is the most complete player of this era, and I don't think that there is any debate about that. Novak Djokovic is the only one out of all 3 of them to win every single Grand Slam at least twice. And for those of you overall that aren't big tennis aficionados, or overall, don't know that much about tennis, that's a big deal. And it shows you overall how complete of a player you are, because tennis has 3 different types of surfaces. Now, of course, they can be a little bit different depending if they're indoor or outdoor, whatever. But when it comes down to it overall, you have hard court, which is usually made out of concrete or some other, hard surface when it comes down to it. You have hard court, and that seems to be Djokovic's and Federer's preferred surfaces. You also have grass court, which plays a little bit differently than hard court, and that seems to be, Federer's and Novak Djokovic's preferred surface. And then you have clay court, and that seems to be Rafael Nadal's most preferred surface when it comes down to it. They all play a little bit differently. The ball moves a little bit differently. It affects the body differently. The fact that Novak Djokovic was able to win at least every single Grand Slam at least twice, it shows you overall how complete of a player that he is, because Rafael Nadal has not been able to do that. Roger Federer has not been able to do that. And that's something overall that is really, really amazing. And like I said, the fact also that he was able to win the French Open this year the way that he did, and the fact that he is the only man of this era to win more than 1 French Open title besides Rafael Nadal, that says something, because Rafael Nadal, of course, is the king of, that clay court on Roland Garros. And if you're able to escape with not just 1 title, but 2, when it comes down to it, now, of course, Rafael Nadal, I do believe he actually pulled out of that 2016, Roland Garros. So I understand some people, they're probably going to bring that up. But when it comes down to it, man, still, Novak Djokovic deserves a hell of a lot of credit. And it's not like he hasn't defeated Rafael Nadal in the Roland Garros before. Now, it's not like he's done it so many times, but he is the only man to defeat Rafael Nadal on the clay court in Roland Garros multiple times. There's no other man in the history that's been able to do that. In fact, Rafael Nadal, he's only suffered 3 losses in the Roland Garros period in his career. 2 against Novak Djokovic and 1, I believe, against a player named Soderling when it comes down to it. And that's just crazy to be the only man. Even Roger Federer was never even able to defeat Rafael Nadal in the Roland Garros once. Novak Djokovic is the only man to do it multiple times. That shows you overall, even on, someone on a surface to where he's very, great on that surface, but obviously not usually as great as Nadal. He's still, if he's at his best, can handle Nadal when it comes down to it. So Novak Djokovic, man, at least if he plays his cards right here and there, he can beat Rafael Nadal on clay like I've not seen anyone else be able to beat Rafael Nadal on clay. I mean, it's crazy when it comes down to it. I really don't know how to compare Rafael Nadal's dominance on clay to another sport. I really don't know how to compare it because it's kind of a little bit different than what it would be to other sports. But when it comes down to it, winning against Rafael Nadal this year in the semifinals within 4 sets and then going to the final, not only being down 0-2, in that final, but, and then coming back, in the last 3 sets, but also against Musetti in the earlier rounds. Maybe that was the 4th round. I can't remember. But Novak Djokovic was down 0-2 in that game, and then he came back in the last 3 sets in that game as well. Novak Djokovic really, man, he's just accomplished a lot of history. And also, if we want to talk about other history with the Roland Garros, which is so important, he now, not only is the only man to defeat Rafael Nadal multiple times in the Roland Garros, he is the only man also to defeat Rafael Nadal, I believe, either in a semifinal or a final in the Roland Garros when it comes down to it. I don't think he's ever defeated Rafael in the final of the Roland Garros, I believe. But Novak Djokovic, he is the first man, I believe, to defeat Rafael Nadal in a semifinal in the Roland Garros. And when it comes down to it, he also is the first man to defeat Rafael Nadal in the Roland Garros and then go to the final and win the final. No man overall who has ever defeated Rafael Nadal before in the Roland Garros ever won the final. Many people predict because maybe it was such a tasking job, or maybe overall they were just facing, a very great player in, the final. I believe Soderling, I believe he made the tournament, the final against Roger Federer the year that he beat Nadal. Roger Federer beat him, I believe. And Novak Djokovic, when he beat Nadal back in 2015 for the first time in the Roland Garros, he faced against Stan Wawrinka. And Wawrinka just seems to be, Djokovic's Eli Manning, kind of like the Tom Brady or, his kryptonite, if you want to call it. So, that's what happened there. But then the next year in 2016, he ended up winning it against Andy Murray. So it is what it is. And if we also wanted to talk about that, Novak Djokovic also has a winning record over other great players of this generation as well, like a Stan Wawrinka, like a Andy Murray. Now, one thing that does have to be mentioned if we're taking everything into context, in finals, Stan Wawrinka certainly does have the edge over Novak Djokovic there, performing better against him than what Novak Djokovic performed against him, usually in Grand Slam finals at least. So, but like I said, everyone has their kryptonite when it comes down to it. But the crazy thing is that what seems to be Nadal's kryptonite and Roger Federer's kryptonite actually is Novak Djokovic when it comes down to it. So that seems to be the interesting thing there. But so that's the history there when it comes to the Roland Garros. There was so much history being accomplished there. And the fact that he was able to win against a very talented player in Stefanos Tsitsipas, someone who really was on a roll, within that tournament. And he was able to beat him within 5 sets, come back in those last 3 sets, really shows you how great of a player that he is. On top of that, man, when it comes down to it, if I were to bring up other points, I mean, let's just, go back to the point overall. If we're going to talk about, who the most complete player is, let's talk about all the 3 surfaces when it comes down to it. We all know who the king of clay is. Of course, that's going to be Mr. Rafael Nadal. So he's going to be in first place there. But if you're talking about, the big 3 when it comes down to it, or even comparing him to other players, I think you would have to say that Novak Djokovic, he's probably the second best clay player of his generation, especially out of the big 3. I don't think you can debate that as Roger Federer. Roger Federer has never even been able to defeat Rafael Nadal even once in his career in the Roland Garros when it comes down to it. And on top of that, Roger Federer, I already mentioned that point, I guess. But Novak Djokovic, he was able to defeat Rafael Nadal not only once in the Roland Garros, but multiple times. On top of that, Novak Djokovic, I think you have to debate that he's the second overall in clay. I don't think there's really any debate about that. He's won 2 Roland Garros titles. Roger Federer was only able to win 1 Roland Garros title, and neither of those times he had to go through Rafael Nadal, I believe, when it came down to it. The one time that he won it, he did not have to go through Rafael Nadal, I believe, when it came down to it. So that's kind of the thing right there, when it comes down to it. Now, of course, I still give Roger Federer credit for that Roland Garros title. I'm not, dismissing it, in any way, trust me. But when it comes down to it overall, I do think it has to be counted that Roger Federer, if we're talking about who the greater clay court player is, Roger Federer, I don't think has the same clay court ability that a Novak Djokovic has. Now, in the Roland Garros, I believe that they're 1-1 against each other in that tournament. But the fact that Novak Djokovic is more accomplished there, I think you have to debate overall that he's obviously the greater player in that tournament and on that surface when it comes down to it. When they faced each other in clay, I believe that they're 4-4 against each other. But like I said, when you take a look at the accomplishments, I do believe Novak Djokovic is the greater one. So that's the first surface that we're going to talk about, clay. Rafael Nadal obviously is in first place for that. If we're talking about all the big 3, Novak Djokovic has to be second. Roger Federer has to be third. I don't think there's any debate about that. If we're moving on to hard court, I don't think that there's any doubt about it. I think Novak Djokovic is the number 1 player for hard court. Not only does he have the most amount of hard court titles out of all 3 of them when it comes down to it, but on top of that, Novak Djokovic, he beats both Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal handily on hard court usually when it comes down to it. The only, maybe little asterisk that you can maybe say is that Nadal has the advantage in the U.S. Open. But when it comes down to it, Novak Djokovic on hard court, you probably would have to debate that he is the most dominant hard court player probably of all time when it comes down to it. So that's something right there. On top of that, the man has 9 Australian Open titles. Just like I'm sure, a lot of Rafael Nadal fans, they would argue that, Rafael Nadal may be the greatest of all time because he's so dominant on that one surface in clay. Overall, he has 13 Roland Garros titles, French Open titles. Well, Novak Djokovic has 9 Australian Open titles, just like how Rafael Nadal is the most dominant man to ever, seemingly play in the Roland Garros tournament. It seems like Novak Djokovic is the most dominant player to ever play in the Australian Open tournament when it comes down to it. So, that's something right there. And just like how Rafael Nadal has never lost a final, I believe, in the Roland Garros, Novak Djokovic has never lost a final, I believe, in the Australian Open. He's 9-0 there against some very great and talented players when it comes down to it. So that's something right there. When it comes to hard court, I don't think there's any debate about it. I think you have to say that that Novak Djokovic probably is the number 1 hard court player of this generation. I don't think there's any doubt about that. If you were to talk about number 2, I think some Rafael Nadal fans, they may try to debate that Rafael Nadal is at number 2 just because he does have those 4 U.S. Open titles. He has that 1 Australian Open title, and surprisingly, I think he actually has, I think he's actually beat Roger Federer more times at the Australian Open than when Roger's beat him, but if I'm wrong about that, someone correct me. But either way, I would have to say that Roger Federer, I would have to say that he probably is the greater hardcore player than Rafael Nadal. That's personally my opinion when it comes down to it, even though some Nadal fans would dispute that. But Roger Federer, in my opinion, he would have to be second for hardcourt. Rafael Nadal would have to be number 3 for hardcourt. So then we move on to grass court. Who is first place for that? Who is second? Who is third? Well, when we talk about who's third, I don't think there's any doubt about who is third on grass. I think it has to be Rafael Nadal. It's not like Rafael Nadal can't play on grass. He's gave Roger Federer a run for his money here and there. He's even gave Novak Djokovic a run for his money here and there. Back in 2018 in the semifinals, I believe it was a 5-set game with Djokovic and Rafael Nadal. And Nadal, with the couple of Wimbledons that he's won, I think one of the Wimbledons that he won, it was over Roger Federer when it came down to it. That might have been back in 2008. If I'm wrong about that, then someone correct me. But when it comes down to it overall, Rafael Nadal, he only has 2 Wimbledon titles. And when we talk about his play on grass, you obviously have to say that he's not as great on grass as either Federer or Novak Djokovic. He's clearly third in that category. I don't think there's any debate about that. So here's the question. Who's in first place? Who's in second place? Well, even though Roger Federer does now have 2 more titles than Novak Djokovic in the Wimbledon, they can somewhat compete with each other in terms of those titles because it's not super duper far apart. And had the Wimbledon happened in 2020 and not got canceled, there's probably a very decent chance that Novak Djokovic could have won that one as well. But I'm not really even going to bring up that point because I think that's a little bit unfair because you never know exactly who's going to win what. There's never 100% certainty with things. So when it comes down to it overall, bottom line is this: Novak Djokovic, he has 6 Wimbledon titles. Roger Federer has 8. But the interesting thing is this: when we talk about who has the advantage on grass in terms of a record, at least in the Wimbledon, Novak Djokovic has the advantage over Roger Federer. I believe he has the winning record over Roger 3-1. And every single time that they have faced each other in a final, which was every single time in Novak Djokovic's peak, and the majority of the time in Roger Federer's peak as well. Actually, you can debate every time in Roger Federer's peak, Novak Djokovic was able to defeat him. He is 3-0 against Roger Federer whenever they have faced in finals against each other in the Wimbledon. My point being is this: Roger Federer is more accomplished on grass, at least in the Wimbledon when it comes down to it. But when we actually talk about peak v peak and who is the better and the more complete player and the stronger player on grass, I actually personally think it's Novak Djokovic. And I'm going to argue that Novak Djokovic is the number 1 grass player also of his day. I don't think that there's really much debate about that. Roger Federer was supposed to be the number 1 grass court player of his day. I think Novak Djokovic has become an even greater grass court player than Roger Federer. That's my personal opinion on this. So it is what it is. So that means that Roger Federer has to be second for that as well. And Rafael Nadal, once again, is third in another category. So depending on what you're looking at, I think Novak Djokovic, once again, is still leading this race. And even if you want to just go based off of that, you can debate who's at number 2 between Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer. There's a lot of Roger Federer fans that would still debate that he's number 2. There's a lot of Rafael Nadal fans that would debate that Nadal is at number 2. Of course, obviously, a lot of their fans would debate that they're still number 1. But when it comes down to the overall, I see a lot of people actually saying that Rafael Nadal, that he's greater than Federer. And I would certainly understand that. I think the argument is close. The fact that Rafael Nadal does have the advantage over Federer, not just in the Roland Garros, but in other tournaments as well, in terms of Grand Slam matchups, you certainly can debate that, Rafael Nadal is greater than Federer. I wouldn't necessarily have a huge problem with that when it comes down to it. But it may drag Nadal down a little bit because I think out of the 3 main courts, I do think that he is third in 2 of those categories. But that being said, I do think Rafael Nadal is number 1, obviously, in clay. And one thing I'll say about Roger Federer is this: I'm not sure if he's first in any of those categories when it comes to being the most complete, player on any of those surfaces. That's just personally my opinion when it comes down to it. So that's something that can be in Nadal's corner as well. But my point being for Djokovic is this: when it comes to who is the most complete player on all these surfaces, first of all, he's the only one that's not third in any of these categories. He's the only one that's not third. And he's also the only one, in my opinion, that can debatably be first in a couple of those courts. There's no other player out of the big 3 that can debatably, be first in a couple of those categories and also not be third in any of those categories. That's another argument overall that I would say that Novak Djokovic is the most complete player, certainly of the big 3, probably of all time when it comes down to it. That's another argument that I would mention for him when it comes down to it. And on top of that, if we just want to mention other things, I believe all the 9 major titles, Djokovic has won every single one at least twice, where Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal, they've not even won every single one of them once. That's another thing that you can mention there when it comes down to it. Novak Djokovic, when it comes down to it, now he has the same amount of Grand Slams as them. That's going to be huge in his favor. And another thing also that he accomplished this year, he now has the most amount of days as the number 1 player for a men's tennis player. He also tied Pete Sampras, I believe, for, having 6 years ending as the number 1 player when it comes down to it. I'm not sure if that's the all-time record or, what it is, but when it comes down to it overall, Novak Djokovic, he's just accomplished a lot of history this year when it comes down to it. So I think, a lot of people need to respect it. I think that all these points that I brought up, I think that all these are very good, logical, and objective points to why Novak Djokovic, in my opinion, probably is the greatest men's tennis player of all time. And just to bring up one last point, I guess, if we were to talk about what also puts Novak Djokovic, in my opinion, ahead of them, you can debate that he's actually the best athlete out of all of them. You can debate that he had the highest peak out of all of them when he was at his best. You can debate that he's the most unstoppable when it comes down to it. And on top of that, Novak Djokovic, he also comes up bigger, in my opinion, than the both of them in the biggest moments. At least, debatably. In my opinion, he certainly would come up bigger than Roger Federer because Roger Federer, obviously, if you're a 20-time Grand Slam champion, you have to come up big in the big moments sometimes. Probably the majority of the time, obviously, you want to be a 20-time Grand Slam champion. But there are certain people out there that even for how accomplished they are, they could have done even more had they not screwed certain games up or had they not, sweated in certain pressurized situations. And I noticed sometimes when Roger Federer, when he would face Novak Djokovic, especially in big game situations, there's certain times where he really should have put the game away. Of course, a lot of people overall always mention the 2019 Wimbledon, where Roger Federer was up 40-15, and it only would have taken one more point to clutch the game, and Novak somehow came back. And that's also another thing. Novak Djokovic, man, he might be the strongest mentally out of all of them. On top of that, his mental and physical conditioning is really out of this world. He's a very mentally strong player. When it comes down to it, he's a very physically strong player as well. When it comes down to it, he's got decent strength. He's not the strongest guy that I've seen out there, but when it comes down to it, he is decently tough. He's decently strong. He's very even with the backhand and forehand as well. He can kill you with the backhand. He can kill you with the forehand. There's not a lot of players overall who have, as even as a chance to really kill you with the backhand and the forehand as Novak Djokovic. On top of that, he's got a great serve. He might be the greatest returner that I've personally ever seen in tennis history when it comes down to it. And on top of that, once again, his physical conditioning, I've seen Novak Djokovic outlast some very talented players just because he can't get tired. When Novak Djokovic really hit his stride, really hit his peak, and I think went on that, non-gluten, vegan diet when it came down to it, Novak Djokovic, man, his stamina and his mental conditioning, they just went up on another level. And I've seen Novak Djokovic in certain Grand Slams and in certain games where he clearly should have not won them, and he ended up winning them just by outlasting people or just by adapting. And I also think Novak Djokovic, I think he has the best adaptation skills. I think he has the best adaptability to him when it comes down to it. I think that he's the smartest player out of all three of them when it comes down to it. I just his intangibles really overall, they're just amazing when it comes down to it. And he really is one of those players that you have to compare, or one of those athletes that you really have to compare to, say, probably like a Floyd Mayweather Jr. or say a Tom Brady. He has nerves of steel in those big crunch time situations, even against other all-time great players like a Rafael Nadal and a Roger Federer. I mean, there's been multiple times where Novak Djokovic, there's been a couple of times in his career where maybe, he messed it up against those guys. But more times than not, Novak Djokovic, he'll come up bigger. Usually, he'll come up, very, very big in the big moments. And that's something that's very important because not every tennis player can do that. Not even some of the all-time great ones. Roger Federer, sometimes under pressure, he can crack. I've seen him do it against both Rafael Nadal and Novak Djokovic. It is what it is. And Roger Federer, even for how talented he is, he had a lot of problems once Novak Djokovic really started hitting his stride. There's a reason why Roger Federer, I believe, went from 16 Grand Slams in the 2000s, and then once Novak Djokovic hit his stride in the 2010s, all of a sudden I believe he only wins 4 Grand Slams. Of course, he was getting a little bit older, but if Novak Djokovic never hit his stride, if he never hit that level, there's a chance that Roger Federer could have 25 or 26 Grand Slams right now when it comes down to it. I mean, just think about it. Think about how many Wimbledons Novak Djokovic was able to pull out, how many Australian Opens he was able to pull out, and a certain amount of other things, when it comes down to it. So that's a very big point right there, and, I think that's pretty much, when we talk about all the points of Novak Djokovic, in my opinion, being greater than those two players, I think overall that all those points are very, very good in my opinion. I think that those are all logical and objective, points when it comes down to it. And that, in my opinion, is why Novak Djokovic would probably be the greatest player out of all three of them. And in my opinion, that would make him the greatest men's tennis player of all time when it comes down to it. And he's only 34 years old. Of course, that is getting older, but we'll have to see what he accomplishes when it comes down to it. On top of that, just to bring up a couple of other points, it is going to be hard for Novak Djokovic, in certain regards anyways, to be remembered as the greatest of all time because there are a lot of people against him, and I'm not exactly sure why. At least I can't 100%, put my finger on it when it comes down to it. But I do notice that Novak Djokovic, that he clearly, is not nearly as loved or as liked as Rafael Nadal or Roger Federer, especially Roger Federer. Roger Federer is the most beloved men's tennis player in the world. Now, the most popular tennis player in the world, even though she's nearly at the end of her career, pretty much is at the end of her career, is Miss Serena Williams. She's been probably the most popular tennis player for the past, I don't know how many years. But when it comes down to the overall, I always see a bunch of people cheer against Novak Djokovic. They're always really hoping that he doesn't succeed, or they're always hoping overall that, he loses or that something bad happens to him because apparently, I don't like Novak Djokovic, I've even seen some people, like after he won the French Open, I've seen some people overall say, well, unfortunately, sometimes evil prevails, which is, I don't really get all the backlash that he really gets, because I don't really see Novak Djokovic as that bad of a person. Serena Williams, even, in my opinion, I'm not really, a big fan of her personality. I'm not really a person overall that really likes her personally that much, because I don't think overall that she's really that great of a person. I mean, just take a look at her at that 2018 U.S. Open against Naomi Osaka and see the meltdown that she had. And everyone can have a meltdown, but Serena Williams, she can be a little bit toxic here and there. I would understand more hate for her, but the mainstream media, they do protect certain athletes. And when it comes to the world of tennis, even if we just want to talk about the world of sports, it doesn't really matter what these certain athletes do. They're always going to get protected by the media, especially ESPN or Fox Sports. Certain athletes like LeBron James, Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady, And when it comes to tennis, Roger Federer, he's probably the most protected men's tennis player out there. The most protected tennis player out there, hands down, is Serena Williams. It doesn't matter what she does. People in the media are going to protect her. It is what it is. Novak Djokovic doesn't have that protection. And I'm not saying overall that we need to protect athletes. I think overall that we need to rank them and, talk about them logically and objectively. But it's going to be hard for Novak Djokovic, because not only is he not protected, he is really looked at in a negative light. And you can tell that ESPN and Fox Sports and these other news channels, they don't like Novak Djokovic nearly as much as they liked Roger Federer. And now that Novak Djokovic is surpassing Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer in a lot of these records, in a lot of these categories, overall, I don't think they're liking it when it comes down to it. And that brings me to my other point when it comes down to it, because I just personally, and I know Novak Djokovic maybe can get a little bit more temperamental than what Roger Federer and what Rafael Nadal maybe do, when it comes down to it. I've seen Roger get temperamental here and there, and sometimes, not always be the best of sport. But when it comes down to it overall, he's not that bad of a guy, I guess. But Rafael Nadal is probably the calmest out of all three of them from what I've seen. But Novak Djokovic, can he get a little bit temperamental? Sure. I've seen him scream at an umpire. I've seen him, yell at certain people, all this sort of stuff. But, I just, personally, I don't see Novak Djokovic as that bad of a person. To me, it's not like he's like a Serena Williams or something like that, where she's had repeated tantrums, or like that toxic feminist rant that she had overall just because she was losing in the 2018 U.S. Open. I just don't see really what's so bad about Novak Djokovic. I really don't think he's that bad of a guy. So this really leads me to two conclusions. One of them being overall, and a certain amount of people always bring up this, when it comes to tennis players. I'm bringing up these two conclusions to maybe why people don't like Novak Djokovic. Now, a certain amount of people, they always mention that there's a lot of racism against Eastern Europeans in the sport of tennis. At least that's what a certain amount of people say. Now, do I think that there is some truth to that? I do think that there is some truth to that. I'm not sure how much racism there is actually against Eastern Europeans. There could be. I'm not saying that I don't completely believe it. But when it comes down to it, what I am going to say is this. I've seen certain athletes that you would count as Eastern European, like a Tsitsipas, who's from Greece. At least some people would count that as Eastern European when it comes down to it. I've seen Tsitsipas, Medvedev, and Cilic, and, Fuskovic, and, some of these other guys that maybe you could count as Eastern European. And, maybe there is some racism against them, but I don't really see blatant, consistent racism against them. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But what I am going to say is this. Do I think that maybe I just haven't been around tennis long enough to really know? I don't know. Because, I haven't been watching it for, a super duper long time. But when it comes down to it, one thing I will say is this. Novak Djokovic is from the country of Serbia. And the country of Serbia is not a very beloved country from a lot of the other European countries. It's not really a beloved country by a lot of countries in general when it comes down to it. So, and I have seen a certain amount of people not like Novak Djokovic because he is Serbian. What I'm going to say is this. I don't know exactly how much racism there is against Eastern Europeans in general. When it comes down to it, I can't claim that because I haven't had, much experience with it, or, I haven't personally seen a lot of it with my own two eyes when it comes down to it, I guess. But what I will say is this. Do I think a lot of people have a problem with Novak Djokovic because he's from the country of Serbia? Absolutely. Serbia, once again, that's not a country that is a very beloved or a very liked country within a lot of other European countries, especially certain countries maybe by the Balkans or a certain amount of other things. But there's a certain amount of Western European countries that don't like Serbia as well. So it is what it is. But I am going to say that first of all, I do think a certain amount of people don't like Novak Djokovic because he is Serbian. I do think that is a very big deal. And the second thing I'm going to say is this, and to me this is the one that makes the most logical sense. I think Novak Djokovic, a big part of the reason why he's not liked is because he is competing against two very big fan bases when it comes down to it. He is competing against the Roger Federer fan base and the Rafael Nadal fan base. And it's going to be very hard to be 100% remembered as the greatest of all time when you're competing against two fan bases that are always usually going to be trying to tear your legacy down. Because now that I see Novak Djokovic now tied up with Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer in Grand Slams, I'm now starting to see people make the excuse, well, Novak Djokovic, he's playing in the weakest era of tennis. These new generation players, they can't win anything. Okay, well, if you're going to say that, then okay, but then don't count the 2019 U.S. Open that Rafael Nadal won. Don't count some of the, Grand Slams that Rafael Nadal won and Roger Federer won, where they won against guys that never won shit or never won any Grand Slams, period, when it comes down to it. I've seen certain people try to say that Roger Federer's competition wasn't that great. I've seen people try to say that Novak Djokovic's competition wasn't that great. I'm not one to degrade competition unless I think that there's a great need to. I think maybe if we were talking about someone like a Rod Laver, then maybe that would be a conversation that would need to be had because, his competition, through certain times, you weren't always sure if the best of the best were actually playing because the amateurs and the professionals, they were not, allowed to play with each other. But, when it comes down to it, when it comes to this, to where the best of the world, they qualify, I mean, there is no debate about it. You're playing the best of the best players of this generation. It is what it is. And it's not like Novak Djokovic had no other competitors for his generation. He had Rafael Nadal. He had Roger Federer really through a lot of their prime years when it comes down to it. And he was able to beat them more times than what they were able to beat Novak Djokovic when it comes down to it. So my point being is this. Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal, they have a very big fan base, and they've had a bigger fan base for a longer time than what Novak Djokovic has had because they were more dominant before Novak Djokovic really hit his stride. Now, the first Grand Slam title that Novak Djokovic won was in 2008, and what the Roger Federer fans will try to tell you is that, well, Roger Federer, he used to dominate Novak Djokovic, when he was in his prime. But Roger Federer, when he wasn't in his prime, that's when Novak Djokovic started to beat him. That's not true at all. And a certain amount of people may not agree with me on that. Roger Federer was in his prime when Novak Djokovic beat him a lot of the times. Roger Federer just turned 39 this year, I believe, when it comes down to it. Roger Federer was competitive for Grand Slams all the way up until 2019. 2020 and 2021, you can clearly say that he was a lesser version of himself because of the surgeries, and obviously he was getting a bit older. But to be quite honest with you, Roger Federer was competitive for Grand Slam titles all the way up until he was 37 years old, and a certain amount of people may not agree with that. Listen, right now Novak Djokovic is 34 years old. Would people right now say that Novak Djokovic is not in the prime of his career? When it comes down to it, it doesn't always necessarily mean that just because you're a bit older that you're not in your prime years. Roger Federer, and a lot of the times Roger Federer, when Novak Djokovic beat him, he was in his early 30s when it came down to it. People forget Novak Djokovic was able to beat him, I believe, overall in a couple of Wimbledons when he was in his early to mid 30s. He was able to beat him, I believe, in the 2015 U.S. Open when it came down to it, when I believe he was in his early to mid 30s. when it came down to it. So once again, this narrative that, Novak Djokovic, oh, he just beat Roger Federer when, he was old, that's not the truth at all. In fact, the truth is that once Novak Djokovic really hit his peak, because Novak Djokovic did not hit his peak until 2011. You can win a championship, you can win a title, your first title in 2008, but if you're not winning it repeatedly, you're probably not at your peak. And Novak Djokovic did not win he did not win another Grand Slam title until 2011, so 3 years later. And that's what my point is, when it comes down to it. People try to say overall that Roger Federer used to beat Novak Djokovic when they were both at their peak a lot, when that's not the truth at all. In fact, Roger Federer, the only big part of the reason why he used to defeat Novak Djokovic a big part of the time in the early part of his career was because he was not at his peak yet. So it is what it is. Novak Djokovic, he was at his peak onwards from that 2011 year onwards. That's when his peak began, when it came down. So once again, a lot of Roger Federer fans, they're going to try to spew you this bullshit when it comes down to it, that Roger Federer was, not in his prime by the time Novak Djokovic started beating him. That's not the truth. All right? Like people try to act like this is a Larry Holmes, Muhammad Ali situation. That's not what it is. All right? And let's also keep in mind, Rafael Nadal is only 1 year older than Novak Djokovic. So that's not going to work against Rafael Nadal either. Would you say that Rafael Nadal was not in his prime years right now? Novak Djokovic is only 1 year younger than him when it comes down to it. And he's won every single Grand Slam so far this year. So once again, I see a certain amount of people trying to degrade the competition that Novak Djokovic faced, now that he actually did tie up to them earlier than what people thought he was going to in terms of Grand Slams. The truth is that Novak Djokovic, he is the most complete player out of all of them. He is the most dominant out of all of them. He has won 19 of his 20 Grand Slams in the past 10 years. He has been in his prime years for the past 10 years. That has been his prime years. Okay? Not anything before that. Yes, he was able to win one title in 2008. But that was one title when it came down to it, or at least one Grand Slam, when it came down to it. He was not able to win consistently. Novak Djokovic was a Grand Slam contender for years before the 2011 year. But obviously when he hit that 2011 year, that's when he hit his stride. That's when he hit his peak. And that's the bottom line when it comes down to it. Okay? Like I can mention overall that, if we were talking about Roger Federer versus Andre Agassi, I can say overall, well, Agassi, he beat Roger Federer the first 3 times that they faced each other, when it comes down to it. So obviously Roger Federer just beat Andre Agassi when he got older. And honestly, if you wanted to bring that up, you possibly could. Because tennis players, by the time they got Andre Agassi's age, they started wearing out a little bit when they got in their early 30s. Andre Agassi, by the time Roger Federer beat him in a Grand Slam final, Andre Agassi, the last time he won a Grand Slam was like 2 years earlier. So that's actually something that you can mention there. But I'm not going to go that route because I think Andre Agassi, even though he was sure a bit older, he still was a greater player. But you notice overall the Roger Federer fans, they're not going to mention it for that. So that's my point being there. There's a lot of people that are trying to degrade Novak Djokovic. It's not a similar situation. Novak Djokovic was beating Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal once he hit his stride, once he hit his peak, when they were near the same age as him, or at least when they were in their prime years and not old. That is a lie. All right? It is what it is. Anyway, and on top of that, just to talk about this year, and this will be the last point that I bring up, and then we'll end the video because I don't think we'll need to talk about anything else. But when it comes down to it, a lot of people also are saying that Novak Djokovic is playing in the weakest history of tennis, and saying overall that, these new generations that, I had one guy, I got into a debate with this one guy about a week ago, and he said overall that Novak Djokovic, that he's getting all these weak draws, and, his Grand Slam shouldn't count as much as a Roger Federer or a Rafael Nadal because he's winning against these new generation players that haven't won anything. Well, if you're going to mention that, then also take away the Grand Slams that both Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal have won against guys that never won anything once in their career, at least one Grand Slam. There are certain guys that they beat in their career that never won anything in their career, that never won any Grand Slams, like a David Ferrer, or someone overall that, the first guy that Rafael Nadal beat when he first won his first French Open. I can't remember the guy's name. But, he never won anything in his career. So, once again, if you're going to play that game, that's fine. But then don't count the 2019 U.S. Open that Rafael Nadal won. Don't count, some of the other times Roger Federer beat someone who never won a Grand Slam. Okay? It is what it is. And it's not like Novak Djokovic. It's not like he hasn't faced great competition in the finals. Once again, he's defeated Roger Federer. He's defeated Rafael Nadal. He's defeated Andy Murray, who's also one of the all-time greats. He's defeated Stan Wawrinka, also in some Grand Slam, wins as well. Not, finals, but when it comes down to it, some tournament wins when it comes down to it. Stan Wawrinka is one of the all-time greats. He also defeated Del Potro, I believe, in the 2018 U.S. Open Championship. That was a game, actually, that Roger Federer was favored in, I believe, all the way back in either 2009 or 2010. I can't remember which year it was, but it was one of those years where Del Potro won his first and only Grand Slam, and he upset Roger Federer, I believe, in a 5-setter. Novak Djokovic beat him within 3 sets when it came down to it. So let's keep that in mind. Novak Djokovic also has never lost a Grand Slam to somebody that's only ever won one Grand Slam. Every time that he lost to a Grand Slam, it was always one of the all-time greats, whether it be Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, Andy Murray, or Stan Wawrinka. I don't believe that he's ever lost a Grand Slam to anybody else when it comes down to it. So that's something that's very important to say as well when it comes down to it. Novak Djokovic has beaten some of the world's greatest players in history, not even just including Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer. And if we're just to talk about his run this year, when it comes down to it, first of all, if we were to talk about the Australian Open, I mean, you're talking about, personally to me, a lot of people, they want to complain about Novak Djokovic getting easy draws. But the truth is that, a lot of times that can happen when you're the number 1 seed. And I've seen Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer, since they're high seeds as well, they get easy draws as well. It's not like Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal never get easy draws. They get easy draws as well. It is what it is. But when we talk about all the runs that Novak Djokovic has had this year, you actually realize that it's a lot harder than it looked. I mean, when we talk about the Australian Open, he had to face Taylor Fritz in one of the early rounds, who's a tough American player. That ended up being a 5-setter. That was the game where Novak Djokovic, I believe, injured himself. And there's some people overall that believe that Novak Djokovic fakes injuries when he's losing a game or, something like that. Maybe sometimes in the earlier part of his career. But I do believe that he actually was injured in that 2021 Australian Open in that game. He was up 2-0, called for a medical timeout when it came down to it. And Novak Djokovic, there did actually seem to be a very bad bruise or a tear in his abdominal region. So I do actually believe him there. But he had to face Taylor Fritz when it came down to it. He had to face Francis Tiafoe. He had to face Alexander Zverev, in that series. He also had to face, the new Russian on the scene, Aslan Karatsev, in the semifinals. And then he faced Daniel Medvedev, who was on a major hot streak within the past year when it came down to it. Won the ATP, finals when it came down to it last year. The very, very dangerous guy when it came down to it. Already made a Grand Slam before, all the way back in 2019. Had a very tough match with Rafael Nadal. People actually favored Daniel Medvedev more over Novak Djokovic than vice versa. I personally favored Novak Djokovic, but I did understand why Daniel Medvedev was favored by a certain amount of people. The man was on the hottest streak out of any recent tennis player within the past few months when it came down to it, at least at that time. And Novak Djokovic was able to defeat him within 3 straight sets. It wasn't even close. And that shows you overall how dominant Novak Djokovic is at the Australian Open. The first set was somewhat competitive. It was 7-5. Then, of course, he ended up beating him in the other 2 sets 6-2 when it came down to it. So that shows you how dominant he is, because Medvedev is no joke. He's a very talented player, especially on hard court. When it came down to it, Novak Djokovic had to overcome a very big obstacle. You're talking about a Daniel Medvedev that was able to beat Andrei Rublev within 3 sets, made him look amateur, made Stefanos Tsitsipas look amateur. He was able to beat that man within 3 sets. That's how great Novak Djokovic was at the Australian Open this year. Then you continue on to the French Open, which, of course, Novak Djokovic is not the favorite there, although maybe he would have been, the second most likely to win it, many people would argue. But when it comes down to the overall, Rafael Nadal obviously is known as the king of clay for a reason. Man has won 13 individual Roland Garros titles. When it comes down to it, Novak Djokovic, he had to get over that obstacle. I don't remember exactly who he faced in the early rounds when it came down to it,
but I do remember when he had to face Musetti. From Musetti onward, it actually was pretty tough when it came down to it. Musetti was a very, underrated player at that time, I believe, and he actually put himself on the scene for beating Djokovic in those first two sets. Djokovic literally had to outlast him within the final three sets and ended up winning that game overall and really just outlasting him to the point to where Musetti actually had to quit due to pure exhaustion, which I've not seen within the past I don't know how many years when it comes down to it, but that was very special. Then he had to beat Matteo Berrettini within 4 sets, very closely contested game within those final couple of sets. Then he had to face Rafa Nadal, the king of clay himself, who obviously was favored against Djokovic in the semifinals. They ended up having an all-time great game. Novak Djokovic defeated Rafa Nadal within 4 sets, having an all-time great game with him. Then he goes to the finals against Stefanos Tsitsipas, who was able to beat Alexander Zverev, who, I understand he does come up short a lot of the times in the big moments, but he still is a very talented player, still one of the top 10 players in the world. That was a 5-setter. Stefanos Tsitsipas was able to beat him there when it came down to it. He also beat Medvedev within 3 sets. Of course, Medvedev, the French Open is not his best tournament, but overall, when it comes down to it, it still was a very impressive performance. That's the player that he had to face off against. The 6'4", 6'5" Stefanos Tsitsipas, great athlete, great defensively, great backhand, decent power. Djokovic beat him within 5 sets, lost the first 2 sets, ended up getting thrashed completely in the second set, losing the tiebreaker in the first, somehow ends up coming back in the last 3 sets, winning his second French Open title, being the only man to beat Rafa Nadal multiple times in the Roland Garros, and then winning the French Open final, being the only man to defeat Rafa Nadal in the Roland Garros, and then go into the final and win the final at the same time. That's something very special. And let's even talk about this Wimbledon draw when it comes down to it. Many people wanted to argue that Novak Djokovic had this easy Wimbledon draw. Well, within the first couple, you can argue overall that, they weren't the hardest opponents. I'm trying to think overall what his first one was. I think Jack Draper was his first one, that young British kid. That was one of the only sets that he lost in this whole entire tournament. He lost the first set, won the last 3 sets against the very talented kid in Jack Draper. Second match came against Kevin Anderson when it came down to it. Of course, Kevin Anderson isn't the same player that he used to be, but that still actually is a very dangerous matchup for the second round. Djokovic beat him within 3 sets. Then the next game, I believe he had to face Kudla, who, of course, is not really a high-caliber player, but he gave Djokovic a lot of problems when it came down to it. He had to get past him. Then I believe in the next game, I'm trying to think, he faced Garin, I believe the Chilean player. He ended up having to face Garin, who is one of the top 20 players in the world. I will say overall that Garin grass does not seem to be his best surface, so if you're going to debate that, that's fine. But Djokovic handled him with ease. But then after Garin, it was going to get very serious because Fucsovics, I believe, if I'm pronouncing that right, the Hungarian player, I believe, that man was on a mission. And I really thought that Fucsovics, that he may be able to give Djokovic some sort of problems because that dude, man, he had actually a great tournament. I understand that they only made it to the quarterfinals, but the fact that he was able to make it that far with the people that he was able to beat, I mean, it was amazing. There were 2 major threats in this Wimbledon, in my opinion, that I thought, okay, if these guys make it against Novak Djokovic, they may be able to beat him. One of those guys was Nick Kyrgios because he's very talented. The Wimbledon, I believe, is his best Grand Slam. Now, he did end up being on the other side of the bracket. So if Nick Kyrgios would have beat Djokovic, they would have had to have met in the final, I believe. But when it comes down to the overall, he's very talented, very physically talented. He's very strong. He's got a great serve. When it comes down to it, a lot of power. Unfortunately, Nick Kyrgios went out in regular Nick Kyrgios style because he doesn't usually take care of himself as well, and he doesn't take the game of tennis completely seriously. So it is what it is. So he went out against Felix Auger-Aliassime, I believe is that one Canadian kid's name. When it comes down to it, Nick Kyrgios ended up getting eliminated. But the other main threat that I thought that was going to be very big for Novak Djokovic was a guy named Andrei Rublev, the other Russian player. He looked great on the grass this season, and unfortunately for him, he ended up getting him eliminated against Fucsovics, but that was a great 5-set game. But Fucsovics, man, he really went on a monster tear in this Wimbledon. I don't think a lot of people really understand that. Just kind of like how Hurkacz, he ended up defeating Medvedev, and he ended up defeating a couple of other decent players. A lot of people were giving him credit. Well, let's give Fucsovics credit when it comes down to it. This man defeated Yannick Sinner, I believe, the Italian kid, very talented kid, one of the top 20 players, I believe, in the world today. If I'm wrong about that, then someone correct me. Ended up defeating Diego Schwartzman. Now, Diego, maybe you can have a little bit of an asterisk to it because Diego, even though he's not bad at the Wimbledon is not necessarily his best draw. I don't think he's ever been past the third or fourth round in that title. I think the third round, I think. So, it is what it is. But then he beats Andrei Rublev, who, to be honest with you, I thought had a real chance of making the final, even had he faced Novak Djokovic. He ended up beating him in a 5-setter. Fucsovics deserves a hell of a lot of credit for that run. And then Novak Djokovic ends up having to face probably the best version of Denis Shapovalov that I have seen ever when it comes down to it. I believe this is the farthest that Denis Shapovalov has ever made it into a tournament. Was looking very powerful, great backhand, southpaw, a little bit difficult to face those guys, meaning left-handed when it comes down to it. Shapovalov, man, he was dangerous. And that might have actually been Djokovic's most difficult game of the tournament was against Denis Shapovalov. I mean, Denis Shapovalov, each and every single set was close. The first one was a tiebreaker, 7-6, ended up winning it 7-3, I believe. Shapovalov, unfortunately, just, had a little bit too many unforced errors, and he was just feeling it a little bit too much. But it was very dangerous for Djokovic. Second set, 7-5. Third set, 7-5. But Denis Shapovalov, man, he was nothing to mess around with. Djokovic ended up getting past him. And then he ends up going to the final. Matteo Berrettini, overall the first Grand Slam that he has ever been to. But Matteo Berrettini, very good player, has had actually a very good season so far. Made it pretty deep into the French Open when it came down to it. And overall, of course, made it deep into the Wimbledon. He actually, I think, has improved a little bit as a player. And he's very physically talented. He's got a great serve. He's very powerful. Of course, he doesn't always have a great movement. He doesn't have quite the court coverage, maybe like some of these other guys do, maybe like a Medvedev or some other guys. But he seemed to be the best matchup for Djokovic in the final in the Wimbledon. And he actually was able to crawl back in that first set. Djokovic actually surprisingly kind of choked it away a little bit, even though he was so far ahead. And sometimes Djokovic, he actually does have a tendency to do that, even though he'll still usually end up winning the match. He does have a tendency sometimes to let opponents crawl back in when he is ahead. So sometimes he actually did that against Berrettini in the French Open as well when it came down to it. So sometimes he does have a habit of doing that. But when it comes down to the overall, then he won the last 3 sets, or the next 3 sets, I should say. Won the second set, won the third set, won the fourth set, won the next 2 sets 6-4, won the last one 6-3. Then becomes a 20-time Grand Slam champion. May I say more? Or need I say more? My point being is this. Novak Djokovic, a lot of people are going to try and degrade the competition that Novak Djokovic is facing. Here's the real truth. Novak Djokovic is facing a lot of very talented young players when it comes down to it right now. A lot of talented young players, but they're just not able to get past the big 3. Really the big 2 right now because Rafa Nadal and Novak Djokovic, they're still kind of on top of their game, in my opinion. And Roger, I do think overall that he's still, even at this age, I do think overall that, he is going to be competitive, obviously. But it's going to get to that point overall, kind of like a Serena Williams, where you are going to get beaten certain rounds that, was not expected. Like Roger Federer, he was not expected to get beat by Hurkacz the way that he did, especially. So Roger, even though he used to be an all-time great player, and he was even competitive for Grand Slams all the way up until 2019, because in 2018 he was able to win a Grand Slam. So it is what it is. But when it comes down to the overall, I think Roger's time is done. In fact, really, to be honest with you, the only player that looks like he can actually win Grand Slams more consistently right now, at least out of the big 3, is Novak Djokovic. And those are all my arguments when it comes down to it. Those are all the things that I wanted to talk about. I don't think a lot of people really understand the type of history that really has been accomplished here, and I'm really hoping to see a segment on this. I'm really hoping overall to see an ESPN First Take segment on this, or a Fox News Sports, Skip and Shannon, something like that. But I don't know if we will, because Novak Djokovic, once again, he's not really as liked as some of these other guys. So we'll see what happens, especially as the other big 2. So we'll see. But anyways, man, that's really about it. I just wanted to talk about that. I was very excited to talk about that. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what you personally think. Do you think Djokovic is hands down the greatest men's tennis player of all time now? I would say that he's certainly leading the race. I think that he is. I think that he clearly is. we'll see what happens. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later, and let me know what you guys think.